Right. So today's speaker is Ali, who's been with the 4C for a few months now. I think you need to accept that over there. And we're just going to talk to us about measuring biodiversity impacts. And I think we have at least one very interested audience member online, Michael Dales. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to the talk.
How do I go?
Move the mouse over to the and the
Cool. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've been doing as part of 4C, which looks at how we can measure the biodiversity impacts of conservation and restoration scenarios. So just briefly, so I'm working as a postdoc in the zoology department, but that's also part of the Cambridge Centre for Carbon Credits, which a lot of you already know what it's about, but it's kind of an interdisciplinary team who are kind of working together across zoology, computing, and plant sciences to try and get a credible, transparent system for carbon credits, which is scalable. And I'm an ecologist, so I'm looking at kind of the biodiversity impact of this credibility, but it's data-intensive work, and the work I'm going to present today wouldn't be possible if it weren't for kind of collaboration and assistance from colleagues in computer sciences. So I probably don't need to convince you, but biodiversity loss is one of the kind of greatest challenges which is facing us today. Human activities such as deforestation have led to extinction rates to be more than 100 times greater than they were historically, and these are set to rise. This loss isn't kind of worrying. We depend on biodiversity kind of for clean water, for the air we breathe, and the food we eat. And these losses are occurring kind of at the same time that we're facing climate change. So that's thought to kind of even put more pressure on biodiversity than we've already put on it already. So we're in a situation where we need to rapidly decrease the carbon dioxide in the air and also halt biodiversity loss. So we think that nature-based solutions is a potentially good strategy to help us halt biodiversity loss and tackle the climate crisis. Most broadly, it can be kind of defined as involving working with nature to try and address societal challenges, to kind of get benefits for human well-being as well as biodiversity. And in this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on strategies which look at kind of protecting natural habitats and restoring natural habitats. So these kind of have the win-win scenario that they lead to increased carbon sequestration, but they also provide extra habitat for biodiversity. But how are we going to kind of pay to implement these schemes at the extent that we kind of need them to be happening? And one promising kind of strategy is to pair these with carbon credits, which will provide kind of funding to support these to the scale that we need to make a real impact on both biodiversity and climate change. So just as an example of kind of a nature-based carbon project, this is the Gola project, which is in a forest in Sierra Leone. It's an area of high biodiversity importance. It's got many important bird species, and it's home to 9 threatened mammal species. But this area was under threat through deforestation, mainly driven by agriculture expansion. But the establishment of a REDD+ project has led to declining deforestation rates, mainly by the supporting of cocoa plantations and supporting intensification of agriculture that there is already. And importantly, the project is partly financed through carbon credits, which helps provide training and support the project to carry on for a long period of time. But this is not really necessarily always the case. There's kind of a rosy picture, and we're all kind of familiar with horror stories in the newspaper about kind of carbon credit schemes and nature-based solutions schemes going wrong. And there's a huge credibility issue with these schemes, and it's not necessarily kind of unfounded. So I think most of you already know that 4C is trying to address some of these issues about credibility by focusing on whether the projects are additional, permanent, and whether they're impacted by leakage. And kind of you'll have heard about them from Tom in terms of carbon, but all of these things also apply to kind of other impacts of these projects, such as livelihood, biodiversity, and justice. And biodiversity is the issue that I'm kind of focusing on with my work. So the relative benefits of any nature-based solution project will often differ depending on where you are in the world. So for example, a project on UK peatland, you're going to be dealing with a completely different set of species to one where you're kind of looking at the Brazilian rainforest. And it will also, the biodiversity impacts will also kind of vary depending on how you go about your project. So for example, on the right-hand side, restoration or retention of natural habitats will have a completely different impact on biodiversity to kind of planting lots of monocultural plantations. And it's important to note that kind of in our pledging of reforestation, about 45% of the amount which is being pledged for reforestation is actually set to become commercial plantations. And this, from my perspective, has kind of a limited biodiversity benefit. And I would say it doesn't really count as a nature-based solution. And it's not necessarily in the long run good for carbon. So I think from these two examples, I think it's really important that we have a way to assess the projects which is kind of consistent globally, in order to kind of have a fair way of assessing where we should invest in nature-based solutions. So what do we mean by biodiversity and how can we measure it? So actually, surprisingly, the majority of nature-based solutions don't look at anything in terms of biodiversity, or they tell a story like this site is home to 9 species, but they don't have a kind of robust framework for assessing the impact of the project. And so one way that some projects do it is they look at kind of the total vegetation biomass as a kind of proxy for biodiversity. And this is done, you can either do measurements in the field, like in the top picture, or using remote sensing. But it's not necessarily a very good proxy for biodiversity. So you can have a high biomass from monoculture and not support very much actual biodiversity of other species. So it's kind of an oversimplification. And I would argue that you don't necessarily get any more information than you get from just measuring the carbon in the project. A slightly more nuanced way is people look at species richness, so the kind of total number of species in a project. But that kind of loses information as well. So you could have a situation where you have a project with 5 species, you cut down all the forest, and you might still have 5 species. They would be different species, and you're kind of naive to whether these species are threatened or important species. So that's also an oversimplification. And species diversity has a similar problem to species richness. And then a final way that people have looked at biodiversity is to look at kind of how intact habitat is relative to a historic baseline. And this is the one problem with this is it's hard to kind of compare across ecosystems and different habitats. So is a 50% intact rainforest the same as like a 50% intact peatland? Are these things equivalent? So hopefully, just to summarize, I've convinced you that it's actually quite difficult to measure biodiversity impacts. It's really easy to oversimplify by looking at things like biomass or species richness, but they are like relatively uninformative about what's going on. But it's easy to be overambitious. So you could say that we need to go to every site and measure everything that's happening with the species and populations and track that through time, but that's really inefficient and not practical. So we need something which is kind of a balance between like good enough but scalable. And currently there's kind of a lack of a robust framework to assess kind of the biodiversity impact of nature-based solution projects. So one approach that we think is really promising is to look at changes in the area of suitable habitat of species. So just quickly, the area of suitable habitat is kind of within a species range, how much of that range, how much of the area is suitable for a species in terms of habitat and elevation. So where can the species actually inhabit? And the reason it's a good thing to look at is it's a key predictor of whether a species is going to persist, so whether it will kind of survive through time. So as species lose area of suitable habitat and it decreases, species actually have an increased extinction risk. And one really good thing is that remote sensing allows us to kind of track changes in a species' area of suitable habitat through time and relate that to whether a species will persist. And a good, one most famous example of people using AOH as a metric is the STAR metric, which was produced by the IUCN. And this is good, but we think it has two kind of shortcomings. The first one is that they don't use a very reliable baseline. So they look very recently across the past 20 years. And the second reason is that they assume that the relationship between the species' area of suitable habitat is related in a linear way to the probability of the species persisting. And I'll just go into these two limitations. So I think the baselines matter, and that the baseline of the last 20 years is problematic. And I'll try and explain it with two example species. So these two species, if you look across the past 20 years, the blue species, which is a skylark, has been in decline. So you might think that that's something we really need to worry about. And the red species is kind of relatively stable. But actually we know that humans have had impacts on kind of the environment for much longer than the last 20 years. And so if we look at a kind of more realistic baseline, kind of pre-1800 or any time before that, you can actually see that the blue species has kind of actually benefited with agricultural expansion. So it's a skylark. And although it's declined across the last 20 years, it's actually not lower than it was historically before human intervention. Whereas the other species it looks stable in the last 20 years, but we actually, when we look at the historic baseline, it's kind of in decline. And so it's really important that you have kind of a meaningful baseline to which you compare changes in AOH, otherwise you will underestimate the impact on some species and overestimate others. And the idea is that before humans existed, species had kind of an AOH size for that species, which that's what they've evolved to have. And so changes in that is what we are kind of worried about. And the second point is that they kind of assume that there's the relationship between kind of AOH, portion of your AOH remaining, and whether you are going to persist is a linear relationship. So for every unit of AOH which is lost of a species, it has the same impact on persistence, however far you go along towards losing all of your habitat. And we have kind of good reasons to believe that, in fact, maybe it's not a linear relationship, and it might actually be a curve. So actually, if you lose habitat at the beginning of your kind of trajectory of loss, it has less impact than if you lose a unit of habitat at the end of that trajectory. And that's kind of like species kind of withstands a certain amount of habitat loss, but beyond a point, it kind of can lead to catastrophic losses. And so these are the two key things that we've kind of incorporated. And so the metric that we're using to look at biodiversity change is called persistence, the probability of persistence, and we look at how that changes through time. And so the two key things that it includes a proper historic baseline, pre-human intervention, and then it incorporates kind of a non-linear term. So if you look between H1 and H2, the loss of habitat results in a smaller change in persistence, which is the delta P, the blue line on the right, than losing the same unit of habitat later on in the species trajectory. And so we can use this metric to kind of calculate what a species persistence is at any point in time. But knowing where a species is along that curve means that we can also know how much impact loss of habitat will have on the species, and that will change. So I'll just talk you through some example species and how we calculate persistence. So this is the macaque, which is found in Sulawesi, and it's a kind of endangered species which is suffering population declines. And it's got a very narrow range, and most of this population decline is driven by deforestation, so loss of their habitat. So to calculate persistence for the species currently, we calculate, so on the left, the AOH currently, which is 4,028 kilometers squared. We calculate the area of habitat in the past, which was more than 4 times greater than it is currently. And persistence currently is calculated as the proportion of remaining habitat raised to an exponent, which for now we're using as 0.25, but there's reasons why it could be something different. And so based on this, you can see that the P is 0.68, and a macaque is kind of quite far along that persistence curve. So any loss in habitat would have quite a large impact on persistence of that species. And then just to look at another example, the Anola, which is the species that's found in Cuba. It's got a very narrow range, but when you calculate the persistence, actually the AOH is very similar today as it is in the past. So the species gets a persistence calculated as 0.95. It's not as far along that kind of extinction trajectory as the macaque was. And so loss of habitat for the species, despite having a much smaller range, we think will have less impact on whether the species will carry on surviving and persist, because it's kind of adapted to having this smaller range and you're not so far down that trajectory. So I kind of showed you how you can calculate persistence at any time point as it being the kind of proportion of remaining habitat relative to a baseline and incorporating an exponential. You could also use this to kind of look at how persistence changes through time. So using the same baseline as the previous slide, you could calculate persistence at 2 time points and look at kind of how that changes, how habitat loss. So here it goes from 8 habitat units to 4, what that means for the species persistence. And then finally, we can kind of, we can use this to tell us about what is the importance of each pieces of land. So we know that this species lost 0.14 in overall persistence, and we can attribute that across space to those cells which were lost. And we assume that that's instantaneous. So it's evenly distributed across each unit of land. So you can say like, which pieces of land are important for biodiversity. And I've done it for one species, but you could also sum this up across many species to understand which area are the most important. So I'll just go through kind of what data sources we're using to calculate AOH and persistence. So first we need to know kind of information about species, where they're found, what their habitat preferences are, and what kind of elevation they can tolerate. And the data we're using for this comes from the IUCN, which provides the kind of the most comprehensive knowledge of species across taxa and globally. So they have information for most mammals, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and then they have some data for plants and invertebrates. And so, for example, for the African forest elephant, they have kind of range maps for the species. So in yellow, it shows the current range, and in red and purple, it shows kind of the extinct range for the species. And then they also have information about which habitats they can tolerate. So for this species, they've got savanna, forest, and shrubland, and they can be found within 0 to 2,000 meters. And so it's true that you could find kind of better data for individual species if you search for it, but this represents kind of the best, most comparable kind of data set across species currently, which is kind of consistently mapped across different regions of the world as well. Okay, and then so in addition to knowing where the species are found, we also need to know what the distribution of habitat types is within that kind of range. And to do that, we're using global maps of terrestrial habitat types, which come from Martin Young's 2020 paper. And that's based on remote sensing that he then classified into kind of the main habitat types. So forest, savanna, shrublands, grassland, wetlands, rocky. And the key reason why we're using this data set rather than others is that it provides, so we can get a kind of an idea of what habitat distribution is like in the current conditions, but also for a baseline, which we're using, which is the potential natural vegetation. So what habitat distribution would be like before humans kind of impacted the world. And then this is available, and we're working with it at its native resolution, which is around 100 meter by 100 meter resolution. And that means, so the reason we kind of work at this finer resolution is it means that we can kind of track changes in very narrow range species, which we think are important. But it means that we're kind of working with more than 1.6 billion terrestrial kind of pixels, which is quite a lot computationally. So if you go through kind of the pipeline that we're working on for each species, to calculate AOH is that we need to know kind of, we take the IUCN ranges, we mask them by the elevation preferences and the habitat types, and then we need to, for each species, sum up what the total area of habitat is in a scenario. And I was in the kind of, I need to be able to do this across kind of more than 30,000 species to get a representative look at biodiversity at this very fine resolution. And I was in a position where the kind of first 3 stages, the loading and masking of rasters was relatively fast, but I was really being slowed down by kind of summing this up at the end. And this is kind of where I got a lot of help from Michael Dales, who kind of, he sped this process up immensely by first kind of working out why it was slow for this final step, but also by writing a program called Littlejohn, which made it much easier for me to kind of parallelize this process across species. So we're now in a position where it's relatively easy to create AOHs for across kind of 30,000 species in a couple of days at this resolution, which is like a huge advance on, like previously people were kind of doing a 10-kilometer resolution and it taking weeks and weeks. So this is like, it took a lot of work and a lot of help from Michael, but it's a really useful thing for us to now have to calculate kind of persistence across many species and in lots of different scenarios. So what can we do with this? So one of the first things that I've been doing is producing kind of maps across the world, which look at the marginal impact of habitat loss on persistence. So this is just showing it for Brazil. And basically what I've calculated is for each kind of pixel or unit on the map, what would be the impact on persistence for each species which is present. So it's like stacked up across many species. And so the dark colors, purple and red, show that these are like really important areas for biodiversity, and the other colors are less important. And places will kind of come up as being important if they have a lot of species, or if they have a lot of species which are already, or some species which are already really far along that persistence curve, so have already lost a lot of their habitat. So I'm starting to now kind of interrogate that and understand what is driving this pattern. But you can see that it kind of picks out like the Amazon is important and the Atlantic forest along the coast. But it's not perfect. So there's some kind of edge cases I need to interrogate. So it's kind of at the moment it's picking out urban areas as also being important. And that's because I kind of lack nuance in my habitat classification, because it's split into kind of artificial, which can encompass a lot of different things. So I need to kind of get to the bottom of that. And I also need to add in birds. So this is kind of currently showing amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, and I want to add in as many species as possible. And the next steps, I really want to look at kind of the opposite scenarios to this. So what would be the important areas for restoration? Like what is the impact if you restore each unit? So this is like a really useful generic tool that it can help us identify like where we can have the most impact if we have a nature-based solution, and where it's got the best benefits for biodiversity. So just to kind of finish off, I want to show you how we're kind of applying this framework within 4C to assess the impact of carbon projects. So I've shown you that we can kind of quantify the global values of persistence for each species in the current time point. But when we want to assess an individual project, we use much better local data on habitat extent to kind of assess how the persistence changes through time for the species which are present in a project. So it's better in terms of resolution, both spatially and temporally. And so what I'm currently doing is I assess like the persistence across species in a baseline before a project starts, at a project end, and then also for a counterfactual scenario. And that's done through pixel matching to find pixels which have a similar kind of trajectory to the project. And then the final additionality in terms of biodiversity for a project is calculated by looking at kind of the difference in the project versus the counterfactual. So just really quickly to show you how that's done, I have like the global AOH values for current and historic, which I use as kind of like a baseline, and then the project site is the square, and then I use much better data to look at how kind of the AOH within the project site changes for a species. So then using that, I calculate systems in the baseline, the end of the project, and the counterfactual end, and use that to derive the additionality. So this is like our framework that we're now applying to each project. And it's pretty good, but it doesn't really incorporate everything that it could. So there's clear kind of bits which I would like to improve. So the first thing is that we're only looking at non-habitat, we're only looking at habitat loss as a threat on species. And we know that there are other things which affect a species which also interact with habitat loss. So we'd be really keen to kind of incorporate things like hunting, pollution, and yeah, like habitat quality as well. And then, so the other thing is that I'm only looking at kind of extent of habitat, like whether there is forest or there isn't forest. And I think that like using better remote sensing data, we can kind of get an impact, kind of get an assessment of whether that habitat is good enough quality for species as well. And then finally, I'm looking at total area of habitat and how that impacts species. But we know that kind of patchiness and location of patches will also impact species systems. So in summary, I think that correctly valuing carbon credits can greatly increase the contribution of forest conservation to the climate and biodiversity crisis. But to do that, we need robust and comparable biodiversity impact measures. So I think I've shown the framework that we're kind of starting to use, but we can build on that and definitely improve it. And then finally, like implementing this required quite a lot of computational memory and processing power. And I kind of discovered that even things I thought were quite simple took a lot of time across many species at the resolution that we were kind of targeting. And that's where I got a lot of help from Michael, who made it possible to do this. So yeah, so I'd like to thank Andrew Bamford and Tom Swinfield for their help with the ecology side of things. Michael Dales, who made the computer side a lot less painful for me, and Daniele Baizero, who wrote a lot of the initial code to calculate AOH upon all this is built. And then, of course, the rest of the 4C team for all the rest of it. And I'm happy for any questions if anyone has some.
Thank you.
For the talk, was like me. I would like to ask about how, I don't know if I lost time, you might talk about it and my lost, but how can you account for the fragmentation? Because even though you have like a big area and you might have like bad conclusions because you have like a big area and you think like, where we know that if the area is spread over a large area, like it's not so cool because there's enough connectivity.
Yeah. No, it's really.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so Felipe was asking about whether we can account for fragmentation, because you could have a large area of habitat in total, but it could be fragmented and not that useful for species. Is that right?
Yes.
So yeah, that's like a really big limitation of what we're doing so far. We're only looking at the total area, and I think that there is a lot of work that could be done to kind of assess like fragmentation and that, maybe borrowing on a lot of population community kind of theory. It's not my first priority, but I definitely think it's important. Whether we kind of have a filter of like removing smaller fragmentation, like smaller patches or remote patches, or whether we do something a bit more nuanced.
Yeah. And especially about restoration, because you can create like waves, like how a place can create like more more valuable because if you are like restoring places without like thinking on the big picture, like probably a smaller area on the right place would have like a big impact for the species that like a big area, not on the right place.
Yeah. Can you say it
Like
again?
raising the
Yeah, so I hope that like the maps that I produce will show us which areas have the most impact for a unit of habitat. And there will be areas which are more important. But it's kind of, yeah, it's a trade-off whether you want to restore large areas or make the most impact for the amount of money that you're spending on that side. Yeah. Yeah.
What is your biggest kind of next priority and why? You outlined a few, but what's first?
So I want to get this, so I showed you Brazil. I have actually done it for the whole world for conservation. So I want to get that kind of finished across all terrestrial vertebrates. And then I want to look at restoration on the other side. I think that one of the most important things to start incorporating is habitat quality, because I've kind of just looked at kind of whether there is forest or not. And a recent paper just came out which said that actually that's not the best predictor of whether the area is kind of good for biodiversity. You really need to take into account kind of habitat quality. So I would like to do that next. Or have someone else do it. Definitely. Yeah.
I like how the framework is set up because you can improve it over time, but then the question is, how do you measure correctness or like how good of a quantification biodiversity is doing?
Yeah.
And then as you make it better, how do you know when making it better?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So that's really good. And I kind of chopped that out. At the moment, using that metric, we kind of have a kind of hypothesis of what is going on in the project site. And ideally what we would do is then kind of ground truth it in some way. I don't think that means that we necessarily have to go back and start doing intense field work. I'd like to try and explore like whether we can do stuff using kind of like audio recorders or camera traps in the field to kind of look at kind of key species that might be indicators of whether this is actually showing something meaningful.
There's been some species that are actively being monitored, so there's probably some historic data. So maybe
Yeah.
if we could run it the same framework on historic satellite images and then see, hey, now what this species looks like and whether this model kind of predicted accurately.
Yeah.
Some or whatever, that's certainty.
Yeah, so there's definitely areas where things are kind of, we have good population trend data. So it would be picking kind of a few case studies where we have the good data to kind of calibrate and see if we're getting something that is close to true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just had a second, will the altitude ranges change as the global warming,
Yeah.
you know, happens?
Yeah, that's another course. So I also assume that the ranges don't shift. And we know that sometimes species ranges are shifting northwards and up in elevation. So that's another level of nuance that is missing. So I think it's conservative what we're doing because we assume that they're not able to move. So like loss of habitat is going to be more intense, but definitely incorporating kind of future projections for habitat distribution and then seeing if we can kind of parameterize maybe for species groups how able they are to shift in response to climate change. So I don't think we're going to be able to kind of actually know this, but like we could assume that kind of birds are more able to shift because they're very mobile relative to say trees. Yeah.
It only occurs to me because they have pythons running out of that.
Yeah.
You can't go away further, right? Elevates to their way to the top of the mountain, so.
Tom?
Just following on from
Yeah.
this point. So the Daniele's code essentially allows us to query when this, you know, in its most up-to-date state. But
Yeah.
clearly it's also changing every year as the experts are updating this thing. So how would we control for those changes in, like, let's say, elevation range or species tolerance as new data comes in from the expert?
Yeah, so that's good. So it's kind of normally like a cycle of kind of once a year, a new release of the data. At the moment, I'm set up for kind of maybe if we have the computing power, we'd rerun these data and update them. Ideally, it would be good. It would be good if we could detect which ones had really changed and update that. yeah, which already since I started doing this, someone's done an update on the birds, so I need to rerun it. But that's like another thing, another thing that I would like to work on is that, like my Brazil map shows like impact of removing 1 unit of habitat, but really removing that 1 unit then changes the value for like all the squares. So if I had like impossible computing skills, I would also like to be kind of able to incorporate this and have it constantly updating in terms of response.
So in terms of restoration, you're basically looking at the impact of additional area on the systems.
Yeah.
But I guess like when you're restoring, you don't guarantee that the area is restored in exactly the same way. Is there a way to incorporate different persistence steps to say like this is a feasible possible type of restoration of this type of systems will change?
Yeah, no, that's true. And we're treating losses as the same, like the opposite as gains. And I think it's not necessarily the case. I think it's kind of, you could be more sure that a loss will have this impact than this restoration of maybe non-ideal habitat. So you could kind of weight like losses and gains differently. But I think also that's something that kind of better remote sensing data will can pick up on whether that is good habitat. But I'm definitely less certain on the kind of restoration side of things. And I also think that losses are instant and the restoration is like got a longer kind of trajectory. Yeah.
So I'm going to read out the question from the things. Thanks for your talk. I have 2 questions. The first one, is there any way of accounting for species interactions, such as the range of at least one species which is the always found in the species?
Like I think it's a really valid point. It's not something that I've kind of thought about in a lot of detail. I think when there are kind of species which are mutualist, you could kind of include that kind of interaction, like for example, like the Swiss stone pine, there's a nutcracker is really dependent on that. So you could add in a level of complexity that if the habitat is suitable but a species is not present, that's not a suitable area. So that's not my priority, but it is really interesting.
And the second question is, like the aerial persistence curve itself gains with climate change. And so what is the possibilities to account for that?
Yeah, I would add, I'm not sure, it could change, I think. I also think that I'm not convinced that we've kind of parameterized it currently. So we think that non-linear is better than linear. I'm not sure what the exact shape of that curve is now. And I think it also will change across species. So I think I'd rather focus on kind of parameterizing it using traits for different groups of species than even starting thinking to what it might look like in the future. But yeah, that is definitely a good point.
And then my own question.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the immediate things doing like neighborhood and so.
Yeah.
So if your species, I mean, I think as you're told, it's probably true that some species like him in the end, and some species don't like him in the end, right?
Yeah.
You know whether you have an egg fixer or not from your land use map. So could that be used to incorporate the chronic persistence will go up if you're increasing the number of edges?
Yeah.
Right, edge line species and down if it's not edge line species. That edginess is quite relatively easy to get into.
Yeah, I think the thing that you could get the edginess. I think the missing knowledge is which species are kind of like that edginess. I think you could probably apply it to some sites where people know kind of a lot about the species present, but I think across the world we're not so certain on that. And particularly the thing we have like a lack of knowledge on is for these kind of degraded artificial habitats, to what degree species can kind of, whether they're present there versus whether they can really kind of tolerate that for a long amount of time and what impact that has on its systems. And so I think for that we'd be limited kind of by species information rather than environmental information. So. Yeah.
So I think the slide you were talking, you don't go back to the one where you were talking about comparing populations to baselines instead of looking at the last 20 years, it might not be representative of the impact change. It was pretty interesting. But how do we know where that baseline is? Like, well, what if there was another huge shift from like 1700, 1800? Where do you start?
And so to get at the baseline AOH, I take into account kind of not just the current range, I take into account extinct parts of the ranges as well, so we get like a better idea of kind of overall what the AOH was. And then what we're using is kind of a map of habitats without any human intervention. So it's kind of what would be the state when humans were not there. So it's not for a particular point in time necessarily, but it does rule out human impacts. So it's kind of the best thing that I think we can get at the moment.
So it's a temporary green species.
What do you mean?
As in, like, if there's a certain species that was impacted by humans at a certain point in time.
Yeah.
That was a different point in time, then you consider them as having different bases.
No, so we take a baseline where there's no humans. So you take everything back to kind of before humans have impact. And that kind of assumes that there's not other things going on. Like species do change distribution for reasons other than humans, but we're not taking that into account at the moment. Yeah. Cool.
Can I just add that many of the things we suggested as extensions would be endless projects.
Yeah, no. Yeah, there's definitely lots to be worked on. Yeah, and like little discrete sections, which could definitely improve the method overall, if anyone's interested. Yeah.
Interestingly, I think Oscar's proposing a project about the changing extent of like optimal places for the coral reef system. It sounds very similar to how changes in chicken.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
You said that we only use the IUCN data, right?
Yeah.
Is there some sort of way to use it for because I know that IUCN is very biased to big mammals and big animals in general.
Yeah.
But I feel like insects and like snails might probably be more indicative of the system.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, no, it's really true. And I think like one of the priorities would be to include like plants, but they're not very like in the ICN, they're not very comprehensive. But I think David Coombs has got a master's student who's trying to kind of get kind of equivalent data for plant distribution that we could incorporate. And that would be using kind of point occurrences to try and draw kind of the same equivalent polygons through species distribution modeling. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely lots of other data sources which might be better for other types of. Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Oh, no.
Well done, Ali.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's great.